Hi everybody, thank you very much for coming to listen to this brilliant bunch of women this afternoon. My name's Karen Ingala Smith. I am co-creator and co-executive director of something called the Femicide Census, and my sister or partner in crime over there, Clarrie O'Callaghan, is the other co-creator and co-executive executive director of the Femicide Census. I'm introducing Clarrie just because she has the birthday party of her 50th birthday of her best friend to get back to in York tonight. So we've had to adapt the panel to allow her to leave and go for a train. So what we will do is Clarrie is going to introduce the Femicide Census recent report on 2,000 solved cases of women killed in the UK. And then myself and the other panel are going to have a discussion about some of the things that are specific in femicide or men's fatal violence against women or deaths of women resulting from men's fatal violence that they've got a particular expertise in. Before Clarrie gets up and speaks, it struck me today that the Femicide Census is essentially a database, and at the moment we have 2,432 women on that database. We know that there are 2,500 women attending FiLiA this weekend. So these were all women that have been killed in the UK since 2009. And if we just think about this brilliant bunch of women who are here this weekend and what a loss we would all be to the world, and just bear in mind that since 2009, men have wiped out the equivalent number of women in the UK. So on that happy note, I am going to hand over to Clarrie. The rest of the panel, they will introduce themselves and talk about their specific area when we begin talking.
Thanks, Karen. So, we know what isn't counted doesn't count. Femicide, the killing of women by men, is more than the high-profile cases that capture national attention and hit data hidden in the Home Office's homicide statistics, and they only cover England and Wales in any event. The pervasive 2 women a week killed by a partner or ex-partner statistic is decades old and doesn't capture the horror of a son killing his mum or other familial killings, the stalker or the stranger who targets at random. And while there was blanket coverage of Sarah Everard's killing in March 2021, in the same month, Samita Mistry, black woman in Leicester, was killed by a partner, and there was one article with 60 words in it. That was the only thing that documented of her killing. So that is why the Femicide Census matters. We know the name and the circumstances of all the women killed across England and Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, and critically data on the men who've killed them. We are using data as evidence to campaign for change. So in Sussex alone, where we are currently, 51 women have been killed by men since 2009. And here in Brighton, 5 women have been killed. I just want to take a little bit of time to just talk about them because it's really important where we are and where we're situated. So Gillian Howell was killed by an infatuated work colleague. Shana Grice, killed by an ex-partner, 5 months after she was charged with wasting police time after repeatedly reporting him for stalking. Samantha Midland, stabbed by a boyfriend in the street, only 600 metres away from where we sit. Faye Isaac, killed in the seafront toilets, only about 500 metres down the seafront. She was injected with heroin, robbed and left to die. Timothy Smiley, who received a 12-year sentence for manslaughter, would have served 6 years and then been released in 2020. And Sue Addis, killed by her grandson, who the jury found not guilty of murder and was convicted of manslaughter by diminished responsibility, even though he had one psychotic episode on the day that he died. As well as Amy Spencer, who died from her injuries after falling from height, where a man was arrested for attempted murder while she lay in hospital, but then released without charge and nothing further has happened. And Emma Crowhurst, whose 2015 death remains unsolved, despite the fact that witnesses heard an argument in the street with her being told, "If you get up, I'll kill you," but nobody called the police. So I'd just like to take a moment to honour those women and the 2,432 women killed by men since 2009 that we know about, as well as the unsolved cases, hidden homicides, masking as accidental deaths, and the women who died by suicide where it should have been recognized they were unlawfully killed by controlling and violent men. So, in March of this year, we published our 2000 Women report, which collated all killings where had there been a criminal justice ruling or an inquest that a man had been responsible for the killing. From that report, we found that in 60% of all killings, the perpetrator and the victim had been in an intimate relationship. But significantly, in 8.6% of the killings, the perpetrator was the son and the victim his mother. This actually generated front-page news in The Guardian when we released the report because it was something that actually had never really been documented before. And we found regional differences in the number of women killed by their sons. In Merseyside, for example, 17% of all femicides are sons, or matricides, sons killing the mothers, with a majority linked to mental health failures by the state. In Sussex, where we are currently, it's 6%, for example. Son-to-mother violence has not received the exposure and recognition needed to protect women from their violent sons who may have significant mental health issues or substance use, and the state fails to recognize that the mother is at risk, particularly when she might be the only one caring for her son and he might be living with her as well. So we do, within the femicide census itself, we have documents and sort of data on so many different variables that we can pull out. So we can pull out just exactly sort of what relationship that we have between the victim and the perpetrator as well. We can also look at basically the ages of the perpetrator and the ages of the victim. And we found that the age of the victim affects who is likely to be her killer, with women in the 20 to 39 age bracket overwhelmingly killed by an intimate partner. And from the 50 to 89 bracket, the increase to son-to-mother killings is evident. Conversely, strangers are at significant more risk to younger women between 14 to 19 and older women from 80 upwards, where violent burglaries are often seen women targeted. A sharp instrument was used in 46% of the killings, but as we know, most knife crime strategies only specifically target youth crime. I don't know if many of you attended Harriet's talk earlier on today about sort of the new campaign that she's doing with Centre for Women's Justice. And it really struck me that she was talking about most of the women who killed their violent partners only use a one-stab killing. But then when we see in relation to a number of the issues around the methods of killing, a number of issues around sort of the methods of killing, and particularly around men, it's overkill in 56% of all cases. So women, to defend themselves, use one stab. Men go over and aboard to 30 to 40 to 50 to 60 times. We identified within the report that 45 women had been involved in prosecution that had been killed by men, although this is really likely to be an undercount because of the way that we were able to identify sort of those who had been involved. 3 of those women were killed in Sussex: Alex Morgan, Leah Ware, and Christina Abbots. Alex Morgan and Leah Ware were the victims of Mark Brown, who tortured both women and kept them captive for months. So the key findings that we had from the report, effectively, we're just setting out here, but one of the sort of the major issues that we were looking at was in relation to manslaughter and murder convictions as well that we found. I'll just go through there. So effectively, for the criminal justice outcomes, you can see that 60% of all the killings involved a conviction for murder. Now, the killing of a woman is probably one of the most unique crimes within the criminal justice system, because actually the rate of conviction is incredibly high. When you look at the rate of conviction for any other sexual violence crime against women, it's absolutely appalling, but the rate of conviction is particularly high. But one of the areas that is of most concern when we look at convictions for us is that the sentencing range for the cases on the femicide census is between 9 to 47 years. In many cases we've documented there are additional crimes to add into it, as well as the aggravating factors that determine the length of sentence. But for us it seems particularly perverse that the method of killing is the biggest indicator of the length of sentence for a single murder. So the use of a gun or weapon brought to the scene carries a minimum term of 30 years or 25 years respectively. Using a knife found at the scene or a perpetrator uses his body as a weapon through hitting, kicking, or stamping carries a minimum of 15 years. But with mitigating factors and a guilty plea, that term can be even less. Since we started this project in 2013, 55 men convicted of murder have completed their minimum term and are eligible for release or have been released. These men have got to go to the parole board. There is a lot of times when we look at sort of the press, you see cases of sort of quite high-profile cases where there's a number of times that they go before the parole board and they are not released. And you know, we take a sort of a sigh of relief because they're not going to be on the streets again. But there are cases that go under the radar that we never hear about in the press. The case of Cathal Comerford, for example, got 10.5 years for murdering his partner. He was released last year. He went to the parole board once. He's now out on the streets. And the family of the family of the partner that Cathal killed are absolutely worried that every time they go into Liverpool, they go into Merseyside, they go around, that they're going to bump into the killer of their daughter. So 211 men convicted of manslaughter and sentenced to prison before 2020 have been released. Only 18 remain in custody for femicides before 2020. So this has massive implications for an underfunded and struggling probation service for violent men. And it's also a serious risk to the women who may be targeted for a relationship by them in the future. We're also concerned at how manslaughter could be manipulated by perpetrators. Convictions for manslaughter by reason of diminished responsibility for men who kill their mothers is nearly as high as for men who kill their partners. But many of these sons have severe mental health issues, and this is reflected in the number of men sentenced to a hospital order, which we found was 76%. But that figure drops to 41% when it comes to intimate partner killings. And obviously, hospital orders of themselves are problematic. We know of some cases where somebody spent 2 years on a hospital order for killing their father, released after 2 years, and then went on to kill their mother. But men who kill their partners and claim diminished responsibility do not seem to have the same level of mental impairment to warrant treatment in a secure hospital, because most of them spend time in prison. The Law Commission is currently consulting on homicide and sentencing, and we are making our concerns vigorously known. So one of the reasons we do this work is to highlight state failures and hold the state to account. In our recent Femicide in Merseyside report, we found that there were serious state failings in every case where the victim or perpetrator was known to the authorities, and we could review a post-homicide report. Some reports have yet to be published, some have been withheld, or some were never commissioned at all, so the figure may be far higher. The horrific killing of 3 girls in Southport last year resulted, rightly, in a statutory inquiry to understand what went wrong with the state's management of the perpetrator. The only other triple homicide in Merseyside prior to this was the killing of Irina Saeed and her 2 children by her husband. Not one post-homicide review was conducted. No domestic homicide review, no public review by Child Services or the NHS into her husband's mental health. We believe the mass killing of a minoritized woman, a minoritized migrant woman and her children only made news because it happened in John Lennon's former flat. All of the news articles led with that. These are state failures by the police, mental health, social care and probation. Families and their lawyers have spent decades campaigning to ensure that state failures evident in the killings of their family members are exposed. Those responsible have to be held to account and changes implemented at a national level to ensure that failures are not repeated. Yet again, all too frequently, these failures are individualized, identified to a particular state employee. But even repeated and multiple individual failings happening again and again over the 15 years is the very definition of systemic. The commonality of all femicide cases is violent men. And any violence against women and girls strategy that's coming has to center prosecuting, preventing, treating, monitoring, and stopping the journey of becoming a violent man. So is it too much to hope that the cause of all this violence is actually named? We want the government and the authorities to recognize the human cost of femicide in the forthcoming and much delayed FORG strategy with concrete measures to end femicide. Every prior government strategy on VOG hasn't even mentioned homicide as even amongst the violence that women experience. Femicide, as we are going to hear now, is a widely used term around the world, and it's important that we recognize that all women, not only those killed in a domestic context, who are killed by men's violence. In fact, the first time ever that the government used the term femicide was in a news article around Christmas by Jess Phillips. Before that, according to parliamentarians, femicide happened in other countries, Mexico, Brazil, Afghanistan, and was never referenced as something that occurred in the UK. There's one government report that was even an answer to the United Nations report on femicide that didn't even mention the word once in the report in the response by the government. We don't have a FORG strategy until December now, supposedly, 18 months after the government has pledged to halve violence against women and girls since they came into power, and hopefully half femicide as well. And whereas before in opposition, many have held some hope that after 14 years of evidencing failures, that we would result in better outcomes by an opposition that gave the sector and its victims hugs and promises. Yet to date, we have been so badly left down and experienced a literal ministerial cold shoulder. If this forthcoming strategy is not fit for purpose, if it doesn't mention femicide, then I believe we all have to unite to force the government to act. This is a national emergency. Thank you.
Thanks, Clarrie.
Thank you.
Have a great party tonight, but not as good as ours. Right, so over to the panel members, and apologies again on Clarrie's behalf that she can't be part of this discussion and that we had to present in that sort of way. I'm going to start by asking each of my panel members, one by one, to introduce themselves to you and to introduce what's specific or different about femicide or women's deaths resulting from men's violence in the either global area or specific community or aspect or angle that they look at. So the first woman I am delighted to join our panel is Ninotchka. Hi.
Hi. My name is Ninotchka Rosca. I was born in the Philippines. I grew up there. I live half of the year in the United States and the other half in the Philippines. I'm trying to be binary. Yes. I write, I organize. I work with the Dakila Feminist Collective in Manila and with a firm in the United States. Having two locations or being in two locations enables me to look at these concepts from the East and the Western point of view. Femicide is not a familiar concept in the Philippines because the homicide rate itself is very low, roughly around 5,000 per year. It spikes only when killings become part of government policy, as it did during the Marcos dictatorship. Historically, the killing of women has remained at a very low rate. I think it's less than one woman killed per 100,000 of the population. In contrast to the United States, 2.9 per 100K, which has remained steady through the decades, up to 3.5 per day. Now, the reality, on the other hand, in the Philippines is that wife beating and physical punishment of children are accepted, tolerated, and even prescribed. Now, homicide rates climb when killing becomes part of a government program, as was the case with the Marcos dictatorship, and very recently with the alleged drug war of former President Rodrigo Duterte, now being held at The Hague by the ICC for crimes against humanity. The official count of those killed by the police is around 6,000, but the Duterte death squads are said to have killed as many as 34,000 in 3 to 4 years. It kind of petered off only because of COVID-19. A bonus system was implemented to reward the assassins. We still do not have an accurate count, nor data that is segregated by gender, age, etc. I went through the list of those who were killed. Some of them remained unidentified, but I ended up with 7 pages of the names of women, 7 pages. Now, Duterte was sworn in as president on June 30, 2016 at noontime. On July 1st, Gloria Capitan, an environmentalist, anti-coal activist in Bataan province, was shot dead by, quote, unknown assailants. This phrase would be almost a mantra in the 6 years of Duterte's rule. The case remains unresolved, but it exemplifies how femicide was embedded in politics for political ends, occurring in public space rather than the personal, private, one-on-one murder that we understand femicide to be in the West. Women are killed for the shock value of the killing because they are the strongest medium for cultural diffusion in the country. They manage not only households, but also communities and neighborhoods. To kill a woman is to terrorize an entire community.
Our next speaker is Cherry Smiley.
Can I go over there?
Yeah, if you prefer,
Okay,
yeah.
it's just easier because I got my thing.
Yeah.
I got my fan club out there.
Way.
Thanks, women. Okay. As I say in the book that I recently wrote, feminism is the only theory, practice, and social political movement that prioritizes and centers women. And when I say feminism, I mean radical feminism. And when I say radical feminism, I mean decolonizing feminism. Decolonizing feminism celebrates cultural differences, but rejects the woman-hating ideas of cultural relativism and refuses any cultural practice that restricts, limits, or discriminates against women and girls because of their sex. All cultures and all traditions are open for criticism and change. Decolonizing feminism always prioritizes the collective liberation of Indigenous and other women and names patriarchy as the central component of women's oppression. Diana Russell defined femicide as the killing of one or more females by one or more males because they are female. In Canada, a woman or girl is murdered by a man or men every other day on average. Also in Canada, men disproportionately target Indigenous women and girls for rape, murder, prostitution, and other forms of male violence. And people in Canada call this the crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. What this means is that most Indigenous women will have multiple and consistent male perpetrators over the course of their lives. Some women cannot count the number of times they've been raped. This means that in some communities, every single woman and every single girl has been raped or sexually assaulted. This means that many Indigenous girls don't plan for a life after the age of 20 years old because they don't think that they're going to live that long. This means that most, if not all, Indigenous women know or are related to an Indigenous woman who has gone missing and has never been found. This means that in some places in Canada, garbage dumps have become the dumping grounds for the brutalized bodies of Indigenous women and girls. This means that some women die alone on dirty mattresses in the middle of the night, killed by the alcohol and drugs that they use to try and manage their pain. This means that mothers are proud when their daughters are prostituted out of brothels instead of on the streets. This means that incest, prostitution, and male violence becomes so normalized for Indigenous women and girls that we don't have the words to describe what is being done to us beyond life. This means that when my grandmother was alive, she would panic if I didn't call her right away to let her know that I got to where I was going, like when I arrived here in Brighton, because she was constantly worried that I'd be taken or murdered. Femicide for Indigenous women in Canada and other women in Canada, but because Indigenous women we have the highest rates of disability, we have the highest rates of being criminalized, we have the highest rates of poverty, we have the highest rates of, we win in every category, we're number one. And because of that, we have very high rates of alcohol and drug addiction, we have very high rates of suicide. And so in Canada, I would argue that femicide happens quickly in the moment, or it happens slowly over the course of a woman's life. The men who are committing violence against Indigenous women and girls are all men, white men and Native men and immigrant men and old men and young men and men who identify as whatever. Many times, these men are husbands, ex-husbands, fathers, brothers, or other family members. Across time and space, men are overwhelmingly the perpetrators of violence against women, and this remains true today. Men, all and any men, disproportionately target Indigenous women and girls for violence and murder, and it's important to think about this issue in this woman-centered way. Otherwise, we inadvertently, or perhaps on purpose, pit white women against Indigenous women as if one has it better when raped than the other. Rape is rape is rape. Finding a white woman's body more quickly than an Indigenous woman's body doesn't mean white women have it better, although some claim that. The issue of male violence against Indigenous women and girls is not different from male violence against women and girls generally. But it is particular, it is specific, with a specific history and specific causes, but the violence is the same and the result is the same. The complete violation and the unnatural and brutal end to women's lives at the hands of men. And I just want to say that earlier, the examples that I read out, there's too many to list. You know, women getting their throats slit, women getting their heads bashed in and ending up with brain damage. And these are all women that I know in my life. These are all women around me. This has been my life. And I think that that's the case for most, if not all, Indigenous women in Canada. You're born into a world where, honestly, like your chances of making it to adulthood, not that good. Not that good. And if you do, the pain and the humiliation and all of that, the trauma of it, if they let you live, you carry that for the rest of your life. And maybe that trauma kills you in the end. So I encourage us all to think about femicide as happening as an incident, one incident, but also slowly over the course of women's lives. And I'll just end by saying that feminism is the only theory, practice, and social political movement that prioritizes and centers women.
Our next contribution from Hannana.
Hi, thank you. Thank you for inviting me. I'm from South All Black Sisters. Thank you. I've got a fan there. I've got lots of fans. Thank you very much, everyone. South All Black Sisters set up in 1979. We've been around for over 46 years, and I've been around a lot of that as well. And femicide has always been an issue for us because it's something that we've experienced in our work. We specialize in the needs of black, minoritized, and migrant women who are escaping abuse. By providing services, we're able to prevent femicide, luckily, with lots of difficulties, but that is our main aim. But when tragically someone dies, it's really difficult on us, and it has happened in our caseload. And also we have bereaved families and friends who come to us asking for help and support in other cases. And we've done domestic homicides, we've done honor killings, which is an area that we specialize in, and also it's not widely dealt with by the sector, and suicide that's driven by domestic abuse, and including honor-related suicide. In the 1980s, we were the first to raise some of these issues within black and minoritized minority communities, particularly within South Asian communities. Around tragic cases of women who've been killed, women who've committed suicide, who've been murdered. And we wanted to raise the issue of domestic abuse within our own communities where there was a silence. But also by the state, where there was a complete silence. And usually that was because of their multicultural policies, or because of blatant racism. But multiculturalism was about not interfering within minority communities in order to respect cultural difference, which meant that if you were critical of things like domestic abuse or forced marriage or honor-based violence, then you were accused of being racist or intolerant. And usually that was in collusion with the community leaders who were male, patriarchal, religious, fundamentalist, and they would often, don't want state intervention because they wanted to maintain their power, they wanted to maintain patriarchy within our communities. So, we did not get the support of the state, and tragically, a lot of women died. Now, we don't know the data, we don't have the information, we know from our experience, we suspect it's disproportionate. There was some evidence to show there was a disproportionate rate of suicide among South Asian women at one time. That data has disappeared. And also there's some recent data about homicide that in London, which shows a disproportionate rate amongst black women. But the data is something we need to work on. But that shouldn't stop us from acting now, because people have to say, oh, well, we don't know if it's disproportionate. We want, like you say, like the femicide census, want women to be counted, women who have been killed to be counted. We want black minoritized and black migrant women to be counted. Usually they're invisible. They're invisible in the data, they're invisible in response of the state, and they're invisible in response of the community and its leadership. So I think she's telling me I've got to stop. Okay, so in the 1990s, I'll come this into the next question, which is about when there was a shift in government policy around forced marriage and honor-based abuse and honor killings, and the response of the media and the state, society generally. And I could talk about the gains that we have made from the late 1990s and where we stand now. But I do want to say that in terms of government policy, the shift that took place was the late 1990s when New Labour came into power, and it was the first time the government set up a working group on forced marriage. It was the first time they had anything to do with minority communities and abuse that was taking place. Women were being ignored, and communities were left to govern themselves, and women were being often forced to stay in abusive relationships through mediation and arbitration and all sorts. So Mike O'Brien, who's a junior Home Office minister at the time, set up this working group saying, well, you know, he was critical of the way people have been. We support multiculturalism in the sense that it promotes racial harmony, although it's not actually anti-racism, but it promotes racial harmony. But also it was ignoring the rights of women and therefore being racist as a result within minority communities. And he advocated the idea of a mature multiculturalism. So basically he was saying, what his famous phrase is that multicultural sensitivity is no excuse for moral blindness. He's saying basically you have to intervene in minority communities in order to protect the vulnerable and the dispossessed and the powerless, which were the women who were facing domestic abuse and forced marriage in those communities. So that's been a very positive step, but it was short-lived because then you had 9/11, social cohesion policy, assimilation, anti-terror work, which sort of criticized multiculturalism to the extent that you lost mature multiculturalism in the process. And therefore, you didn't get the kind of radical change that we had wanted under mature multiculturalism. And since then, we've had the erosion of human rights, so even the human rights argument has been quite difficult to use.
Thank you. And finally, on our first issue, Sharon.
Hello, my name's Sharon Holland. I lost my daughter Clarrie 2.5 years ago to domestic abuse-related suicide. There was coercive control involved in the relationship. It was quite hidden because I didn't know the majority of what was going on. We did get a conviction. He was sentenced 3 years, 9 months. But he had 15% taken off for good behaviour, and his letter of remorse, that he smiled all the way through as it was read out, and his little courses in prison. So he should have been out in January this year. Thankfully, he got convicted again for a previous ex. He got another 3 years, 7 months, and then he'll be out October next year. So for 2 girls, 1's dead. He's, 3 years, 9 months roughly for both of them. So after he was convicted for Clarrie, I set up a petition calling for a statutory offence of manslaughter, because as far as I knew, because our police officer had actually tried for it didn't exist, manslaughter connected to suicide. As I started campaigning, I learned that it was always in place. It just hadn't been used for a very long time. I think it was 2017. So, and now they are actually using it. I've been told it's to do with my campaign, but, you know, I'm still in shock that I've managed it. So, but what we have now, we've just set up, is over 40 families found me during the 2 years of campaigning, and out of 40 families, only 4 of us have had a conviction. A lot of them are stage suicides and suicides connected to coercive control. So I was really shocked that there was hardly anyone that had a conviction. So I decided to try and do a campaign for them, to give them the voices so they could all, because the press don't want to speak to people that haven't had a conviction. You know, they haven't got a voice. If they've got an investigation going on, they're being told not to speak to the press or anyone. So you've got families who've been fighting 7, 8 years. One of them finally got manslaughter this year, but he hasn't been to court yet. So you've got these families that are turning into solicitors, coroners, God knows what, and fighting a system that they feel like they're never, ever going to win. Never. And their healths are deteriorating and they're going downhill, and it's just an awful thing to see. So, but the good news is the new families that are now coming through that have just lost someone, not that that's a good thing, they're now fully equipped when it comes to the police. So they're firing the police with, well, you should be doing this and you should be doing that. And the police are saying, where are you getting your information from? So now, because when I was first thrown into all this, I didn't know anything about anything until I found Pam, which is Kelly Sutton's mum, and she told me how to do everything, what solicitor to get, you know, the inquest, we can get unlawful killing and everything else. But we do have a families campaign ready to go with demands. One of them is calling for the police not to shut a suicide straight down and actually investigate if there was any abuse. You know, we're calling for legal aid for all families, because if they have a house, if they work, they can't get a solicitor, and it is an absolute minefield without a solicitor. So we've got some really good demands, and we launch on 21st of October in Portcullis House. So, and I've given them a voice, thankfully. Yeah.
Thank you. I think, Sharon, you touched on something that I think is evident when we look at the way that the state has adapted to men's violence against women over the last, 50 years. The changes that we've achieved have usually been pushed for by feminist activists, and when I say feminist activists, I'm talking about survivors, women survivors of men's violence in that group, because I don't think we're two different groups, and also from families of people that have, women usually, that have been killed. You know, the state hasn't adapted its response because it felt it should get better. It's been a fight from families, from activists to achieve change. So on that, the next issue that the panel are going to look at is what are some of the key problems in the state's response and or the media's or anybody else's, but some of the issues that women are facing. So this time, Cherry is going to speak first. Do you want to go back up?
Yeah,
or?
I want to go back up.
Yeah.
It's just weird to... It's weird to do it with my laptop on the little table. So, in Canada a few years back, given all the male violence that was happening and Indigenous women were being murdered and disappeared, we ended up having a national inquiry into the issue. And now you would think that after decades and decades of Indigenous women and their allies calling for Canada to launch this national inquiry into the crisis of murdered and disappeared Indigenous women and girls, that we would finally get our inquiry when it was announced the federal government would launch an inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls in Canada, right? Wrong. What we got was an inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and 2S LGBTQIA+ people, which is actually an inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous people. Indigenous women were essentially kicked out of our own inquiry, meaning that we don't get to be centered in our lives or even in our deaths. We got to focus not on women, but on families and on the pain of the families and the families' perspectives. And don't you dare disrespect the families, despite the fact that statistically, many of these male family members committed violence against their murdered or disappeared female partners or relatives. The inquiry had from the very beginning an explicitly families first agenda, which I think should have been perhaps a women first agenda or a feminist first agenda, would have made a much bigger difference when investigating the issue. The other response that we got from the inquiry was demands from across the country, from across Canada, to call it genocide. But it's not genocide in this context. It is femicide in this context. In Canada, men are targeting Indigenous women and girls for violence and death primarily because we are female. Otherwise, they'd be targeting Indigenous men too in the same way, and they're not. To call this genocide covers up what's being done to women because we are women. I used to think back in the day that men were targeting Indigenous women to harm our Indigenous nations. But after listening and learning and reading and a ton of self-reflection, I no longer think that. I think now that when femicide is described as genocide, it turns women into instruments through which colonization and genocide happen. As Kimberly Crenshaw and others have theorized, women in these cases aren't victims ourselves, but we become a conduit through which to harm the nation being the most important, and the nation being men, of course. Indigenous men, in fact, use an excuse of colonization to excuse their violence that they commit against Indigenous women and girls. The last thing that we got out of the inquiry and in the public discourse surrounding the inquiry was that there was basically no consideration of feminist theory or feminist knowledge about male violence against women and girls during or after the inquiry. Essentially, we were and are treated as if Indigenous women are from some other planet, wholly and completely disconnected from other women in our experiences of male violence. But rape is rape is rape. The results are the same. I think that this, shift to talk about, and not even male violence, it was like violence against people, Indigenous people. So it's not, we don't even talk about male violence. It's violence. There's some women think that we should be using the term manslaughter instead of murder, because it's better for the families. So to kind of hide the reality of the violence, of the male violence that is happening, and this is what we're looking at. So to have that, the inquiry shift, and it shifted kind of halfway through due to pressure from 2S LGBTQIA+ groups in Canada, just was so devastating for so many women who had fought for so long to have this inquiry. And then to have the families given priority over women, over feminist ideas, feminist perspectives, and knowing that some of these family members are perpetrators, some of these male family members are perpetrators, was absolutely devastating. And then to frame the whole issue as genocide, we push women out. Women are just become the way which colonization happens, as opposed to we becoming victims of colonization in our own right because we are women, not simply because we reproduce for the nation. And that's a tough one now. That was a very tough one. And then the lack of feminist theory or any feminist knowledge. There's so much, we have learned so much and we've done so much over the years, and all of that was completely ignored. So we had this opportunity, I think it was a 3-year-long opportunity, and it was totally wasted. And we ended up with a national action plan and all kinds of things. I think it was over 200 recommendations that came out of the inquiry. It was a bit nuts. And the reality is that we're no better off than where we were before. The only difference is now we've had the inquiry, so we're not going to have another one. So it was a huge missed opportunity, and I'll end there.
Next, we're hearing from Ninotchka again.
Hi. It's hard to say what is lucky. Pattern detection, I think, is a particular weakness of the media in the Philippines, and you couple that with a lack of understanding of feminism and feminist theory. When I left the Philippines, the big quote-unquote feminist discourse was the color of the armpits of this one woman, which was really, I was like, what is that? So the tendency to report an event as a discrete happening rather than as part of a pattern is really a weakness in the country. For instance, the manner of killing visited upon men and boys was different from that visited upon women and girls. Men and boys were abducted, their bodies dumped with signs of extreme torture, and usually the head and the face wrapped in packing tape. Okay, their hands tied behind them. Only 2 women were killed in this manner, and I have like 7 pages of names of women killed. By and large, women were killed publicly while doing the most ordinary things. And I have a photo here. Hi, Miss Julie.
We did have the photo when you were speaking before. Yeah, so we did see the photo before.
I told her I'd
Okay,
sit
but if we could have it, no, okay, we can't have it again. So you remember that particularly graphic, horrible image?
Yeah.
That's, thank you. We've got the picture.
Here. This was very public. She was eating by the roadside at a food store, eating watermelons, 29 years old. And she was just shot dead. Nobody knows why. And nobody has come up with any reason for her being dead. And immediately, a crowd gathers, and everybody is like, oh my God, what happened, this kind of thing. And this kind of public, very public execution is done to women. For instance, a 5-year-old girl was shot inside a church during Mass, and nobody knows why. Why? But another one, a young woman who was a student of mass communications, was killed inside a public transportation vehicle, and she had no connections whatsoever to drugs. So it's like shock and awe to terrorize everybody. Okay. The public assassinations appear to be meant to deliver terror to specific population sectors, activists, advocates, church people, community people. Since the assassination of women is very uncommon, women, as you know, are highly prized in the Philippines. We export them to 200 countries all over the world to work as domestics. So to kill them is to lose merchandise. Now, I went through the list of the killed during this so-called war, and while a few were characterized as drug pushers or drug users, the more frequent characterization was called wife of, girlfriend of, live-in partner of, and somewhere mother of, grandmother of. No male name was characterized as the husband of. So there is this transferred violence. This is also evident in what we call, what is called palit katawan, body substitution, literally, where the police would demand sex from the wife or the daughter if the man of the family is not caught. Despite the women's submission to such a demand, the family man will still be killed later on. There aren't too many accounts of palit katawan, but this might be due to reticence on the women's part. It is crucial that we begin to recognize gender violence can be and often is part of the armory of state terrorism and should not be treated as occurring only in the private sphere, that it is often enmeshed in the politics of fascism, and that we need to develop measures to counter, to resist, and to stop it.
Thank you. Sharon, do you want to go next? Yeah, no, Sharon, then Hannana. I'm swapping you around. Keep you on your toes.
What was the question again?
Key issues, key things that went wrong. What could the state have done differently, or key things you want to take about them?
Things that what went wrong with Clarrie was failed by many agencies. 17 involved, only 3 helped her. The one being, the worst one was the police, utterly. Clarrie was a bit of a wayward child, teenagers, you know, they get up to mischief, hang around with the wrong type and do all sorts. And she'd get in trouble a bit with the police. But I feel, because she was a bit of a pain in the bum with them, they couldn't be bothered. They just couldn't be bothered to help her. There were so many opportunities to save her. Even on the day she finally did it, there was an opportunity earlier on. I told them to take her to the hospital, and they said they were too busy and they had other jobs to do and dropped her off with a friend. So then, when she was at the friend's, they did actually were taking a statement. Mental health team had rung up to speak to her, and they said, no, we're doing a statement, ring back later. By the time they rung back, she'd already done it. So, as a parent, it's bad enough your daughter doing that. It's bad enough finding out that some monster had done that to her. But to find out the failings, to me, feels so much worse, because these people are paid to protect and safeguard, and they're not doing it at all. So the media, I think, everybody needs to share about domestic abuse-related suicides, because they are higher now than the murders. So I think we need to get the story out. I think the public needs to understand the psychological impact on the victim. And I said this to someone earlier on. To me, the perpetrator is pushing them to suicide, messing with the head, making them believe they've got no one, and they're keeping their hands clean. Do you know what I mean? They're keeping their hands clean. So it is a form of homicide to me.
Yeah.
And I think the more we get the words out there and hopefully have more convictions of manslaughter, well, hopefully get a conviction of manslaughter, it would be a prevention to these monsters to stop doing it. So I personally think we need to start from education, sort the next generation out and work our way all the way up and deal with it bit by bit, but we've got to stop it happening to the youngsters because it's getting worse to them now. Yeah.
Thank you.
It's okay. I'm going to clap now.
Hannana.
Okay, as I was saying before, just carrying on from that, about the state response, there was a shift in the late 1990s, and there was a lot of increasing government action, particularly around forced marriage, and a lot of media coverage. It was the first time that the media started covering these issues as well. You know, it's always a mixed blessing with the media. Some of it would be racist and sensationalist. Some of it would be useful and supportive of what we would say, what we were trying to say, because we have always been very critical of the lack of state action. And this was our opportunity to make sure that black, minoritized, and migrant women were included in terms of any kind of change or reform. And with the working group on forced marriage, you know, we got a lot of things done through that, you know. And eventually we got, you know, we managed to get the Forced Marriage Civil Protection Act, and later on it was criminalized as well. And we got statutory guidance on forced marriage. Very little has happened on honor killings and honor-based abuse, although that is far more recognized in the media, certainly in the late 1990s, which was, you know, the case of Rukhsana Naz was what triggered the working group. She was killed by her mother and her brother for leaving her husband. She'd been forced into marriage, and then becoming pregnant to her boyfriend. And that case was known as a forced marriage case, but it was also an honor killing. And because, you know, she had dishonored the family. But the first case of honor killing that was recognized by the media was that of Heshu Yunus. And later on, there was Sajid Atwal, which was a more complicated case where a woman was killed overseas. In a lot of our cases, women are persuaded to go overseas and are killed there by their in-laws or extended families because they're trying to evade justice in this country. And that is another area where the state has not done enough in terms of addressing these overseas murders, or where the perpetrator escapes overseas, like we've had the recent case of Hashita Brella, where she was killed by her husband and then he's disappeared overseas and they haven't tracked him down yet, or extradited him. But usually it's from countries where there's no extradition agreements. Despite those positive developments, and there's been guidance, there's been training of professionals, it hasn't fully materialized in practice. You still get failures, and you know, I read domestic homicide reviews all the time where there is this, you know, constant failures. And the failure, of course, the same failures that women from other communities experience, but also around racism and cultural sensitivity, still an issue, where they don't want to be seen as interfering. And so one of the big cases we've been involved in from 2006, where is the case of Banaz Mahmood, who was killed by her father, her uncle, and 5 male cousins. There was a whole conspiracy to kill her in an honor killing. And whilst the police were very good in getting the conviction and the extradition, because these men, two of the killers had gone off to Iraq and they brought them back. There was amazing work by the police, but they had completely failed to prevent the killing in the first place. Now, Banaz had reported to the police 5 times before her death about threats to kill her, the conspiracy to kill her, attempts to kill her, rape and violence and all sorts of things. None of that was acted upon. And certainly there was, you know, a feeling that they did not want to be seen as in this culturally sensitive area around honor. And I mean, a lot of the time they don't even understand it. I mean, you know that there's 2 main issues here, that they either miss it or they don't understand it, or they dismiss it. And the dismissing is where they don't want to be seen as interfering in the culture, or they're racist. So that is a common problem around honor-based abuse, but also other areas around the intersection with migration. You know, Hashita Brella's case involved a migrant woman who was killed by her husband, and the migration element is kind of not really fully been acknowledged by the media or probably by the state. And again, we want to make sure that that there is a strong link between femicide and insecure immigration status, which we need to also address, which then puts a responsibility on the state to change the laws so the migrant women are not kind of entrapped in this situation, which escalates to murder or suicide. We've also had problems with the inquest system that still continues. In one case of Nazia B, her and her daughter were killed by her husband. It wasn't clear if it was suicide, murder, or accidental. And usually we know that a lot of these murders are disguised accidents as well. And or suicides, and sometimes they're suicides, sometimes they're disguised as suicides. The inquest coroner refused to have an inquest because the husband was a male, it was male, yeah, but he was also a cousin. It was a cousin marriage. So his family and her own family didn't want the inquest because they wanted to cover it up. And again, we had to go for a judicial review as Southall Black Sisters to try to get to do a judicial review to have an inquest so we could uncover the reasons for her death. We weren't successful in that judicial review, but it shows how far you need to go to even get the state to acknowledge these types of issues. So I think the state's response in some respects has been good, but again, we're still struggling and fighting. Families, you have been struggling. We as an organization have been struggling, supporting families, and we still have some way to go.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Next question then, and actually there are two parts to this, if you could address both issues, if you can. Are there any sort of key issues that you would like to respond to, sort of highlight in feminist responses, or things that women have achieved, that we've made a difference in relation to the area you're specialist in? And then also after that, is there anything that women in the audience here could do to support, to make a difference to the work that you're doing? Sorry, yeah, I'm looking at you, Sharon. You go first for this time. I was indeed.
Sure then.
I was letting you know.
I found over the 2 years of campaigning, social media, it can be quite good, especially TikTok's really good for getting the word out. I think if everybody just shares, speak about it, show what happened to someone like my daughter, there's others out there it's happened to, let people know that it's very hard to get that manslaughter, to connect that coercive control up. And also, what I've also found, like since this has happened to me with what Jane said here, is people still don't know what coercive control is and still never heard of it. There was 12 people on a podcast I'd done downtown in Portsmouth, and nobody had heard of coercive control by one, and I think that is so important to get that out there as well, because these youngsters, they're in it and they don't even realise they're in it, and that's what worries me. It could be going on in families, it's the norm, you know what I'm saying? Because, I witnessed domestic abuse as a child, lost my mum to domestic abuse-related suicide as well. Then I went through it, and now I've lost my daughter. And I also want people to understand trauma, what trauma does as well. It can come out as ADHD, a bit loopy. I just think if we keep sharing these points on social media, keep speaking, maybe protest, I don't know, anything to get it out there and speak to everyone and teach children about coercive control. If I've succeeded in what I've done, I just want to save one life, and that's it. So, and then my daughter didn't die in vain, and that's all I want.
Thank you.
Yeah.
While you were talking, Sharon, about coercive control, I was thinking, we know men's violence against women harms women in relationships, whether they're in intimate relationships or in family relationships, and controls and restricts women's lives. And I think there's the parallel, isn't it, that it, again, personal and political are both working, that men's violence against women acts as a form of coercive control to all women all the time because of the threat of that violence, and we, you know, the way that we have to,
how they isolate.
Yeah.
They start with the friends first, then the family. I didn't know everything that went on. I didn't know until afterwards. You know.
But it's one of the ways that women continue to be subjugated, isn't it, and kept in our place. So that just sprung to my mind while you were talking. Hannana, if you could.
You'll go again.
Yeah, now don't tell us all every single gain of Southall Black Sisters, because we'll be here for a while.
I'll tell you about our current campaigns. These are like gains. They're still fighting for these.
Tell us some of the stuff.
Yeah, for where people
You're
can
a brilliant
support. And I think that, but you know, what I just want to say generally about feminism is that it's got to be intersectional and progressive. So if you are intersectional and progressive, then you've got to look at race and sex, you know, and other forms of structural inequalities. And in order to do that, we have to work together. We have to have solidarity. And you have to make sure that whatever you do, you incorporate the needs of Black, migrant, and minoritized women in any kind of campaigning you do. And we spend our lives supporting the women's sector in their campaigns. We would like some of that back. Thank you. That's why we get old and grey-haired, right? So in terms of our current campaigns, I'm just going to talk about the two main ones besides the migration one, but I won't get into that. But in terms of femicide, we are campaigning for suicide to be recognized, you know, as a criminal offense. Actually, we're trying to get it to be recognized as murder if it's driven by abuse. And we went to Parliament recently, and there was an amendment through Parliament, and surprisingly, we got over 50 MPs in Parliament to support that. And I think that there is support. It was cross-party, and I think there is support for that we need to work together to try to achieve. And, you know, we would be asking for more support from people on that one. The other area is another campaign called Benaz's Law. I know Paisley might be in this room, and I know Paisley, I want to acknowledge Paisley, who is the sister of Benaz. And I know Paisley's done a lot of work around forced marriage and honor-based abuse. But I'm here to represent another sister, Bakal Mahmood, who cannot be here. And the reason why she cannot be here, that she's on a witness protection scheme because she gave evidence against her father and uncle and 5 male cousins, people within the community. And apparently there was a conspiracy involved 50 people in the community, according to the police. So she's in extreme danger. She was the only one who gave evidence for the prosecution. And she's now in witness protection for life. But one of the things that she's campaigning for, that, you know, I supported her throughout this time, as South of Black supporting her campaign, is for Benaz's Law, for honor to be seen as an aggravating factor in sentencing. Again, we put an amendment through Parliament on this, and we got over 50 MPs to support that. So again, you know, we would really like your support in this for that to be, you know, to become law. Again, Labour Party knows all about all of these campaigns, and I have supported it in the past in opposition, but have failed to do it now. So we really would like to increase that pressure on them to do that. Thank you.
Thank you. Ninotchka. Hi.
I think one of the really bad things that happened in the Philippines was the substitution of gender and development for feminism. And so you end up with a view of women as merchandise, as, you know, part of the cog of capitalism. So we need to return, to restore the focus on feminist theory. That is the first. The second, and I think a lot of people won't like my saying this, is we really need to stop the export of women.
We do like you saying that.
We do not have aggregate statistics on how many of our women have been killed overseas in the Middle East. Nobody bothers even to keep those statistics. But I personally feel that we have to stop this quasi-slave trade. That's the second. We need to, there's really no publication right now, no podcast, no nothing, that talks about feminism in the Philippines. And this is an absolute travesty, really. So, I don't know if anyone in the audience can support such a thing, but if you can talk to me, please, talk to me.
When you were talking then, I just got a little fantasy idea. You know, FiLiA moves around the country in the UK to different cities, and none of us are rich enough to do this, but I did think, FiLiA in the Philippines, maybe.
I was just telling somebody, I think I will organize a conference in Asia.
Brilliant. Thank you. Cherry, back to you.
So I guess there's maybe two things that I want to mention. The first one is when a sister asks, you answer her. And I think that it's hard to ask. It's hard for us to ask. There's all kinds of reasons why. And too often, the ask gets pushed aside. It's seen as something that's not important. It's something we'll do later. And, you know, there are women in this room, white women in this room, who have talked the talk and walked the walk. And when I've needed her, she's been there for me. So thank you, Jax. And that's real. And I remember that, and I know that. So sometimes it's really easy to say, yeah, we'll be there for Asian women, Indigenous women, Black women. And it's easy when it's easy. But when it's hard, that's when it really matters. So when we're asking, answer would be my first potential solution. My second one is a little bit more theoretical, but that's to in Canada, because we're talking about colonization, that's kind of the big issue when it comes to Indigenous people in Canada, and I would encourage women to consider that colonization as a term, as a concept, was defined by men. Like, men made that up. And men have serious blind spots. And so I would encourage us to think of a woman-centered, of a female-centered definition of colonization. How does that change things, and what does that look like? And to apply that when it comes to issues of male violence against women and femicide. So I'll just give you a quick example. I can't tell you how many times in my former life as a PhD scholar, I had non-Indigenous academic women come up to me, and we're talking about my research, and I'm saying, yeah, there's this and there's this, and what about the incest? That's a huge problem that Indigenous men are raping their daughters and their granddaughters and sexually abusing them. It's a huge issue. And what I was told over and over again was, don't talk about that. Don't say that. Why? Because Indigenous men are, they're going to face racism in the prison system. They're going to face racism in the media. And I don't give a fuck. Like, they can fight that fight. That is not my fight. And when we're told that and we're reminded, oh, it's going to be hard on him, we know that already. We already know that. We know that. I know that. It's going to be hard. We're going to get oftentimes pushed out of our families and our communities for standing up against male violence. If we get to be apart, we're often isolated. There's very serious consequences, and kind of in how our communities and families work, where relationship is so important, it can be absolutely devastating to speak out and to say, you know what, no pimps at the dinner table. Like, not gonna happen. But what happens is she gets pushed out. She gets pushed out, and he's allowed to sit there at the dinner table. And so anytime an Indigenous woman or a woman of color is disclosing violence, just listen to her and let her speak. So don't remind her about how tough it is for him, how hard it is for him, how tough colonization was for him. Just listen to her and let her speak. And I think that, I think the issue of colonization is because we're so used to thinking about it from a male perspective. That's how we think about it. To think about it from a female-centered perspective actually includes women. And that's partly why I was saying feminism is the only theory, practice, political social movement that always centers and prioritizes women. So if we're looking at colonization, but we're not looking at it from a woman-centered perspective, bits are going to be left out, and those bits are going to be women and girls. I'll just say one last thing, which is back in the 90s, there was a really amazing Indigenous woman from my community, actually. And back in the 90s, there was a big call for self-government for Indigenous communities. And it had happened in different places, but she said, okay, but if we get self-government, like, what changes for Indigenous women? It's still the same men that are harming us, that are discriminating against us, that are raping us and killing us. So how does that benefit women? And I think I see that even now in terms of land back movement and these kinds of things. It's like, okay, land back, but what for women? Like, what do they get back, right? We don't get back our safety. We don't get back our dignity. We don't get back, our the rights that we inherently have as women. Men just get more, and we kind of are thrown to the side and are just extra waste, basically, in that process. So if we center women in everything we do, and when it's easy, it's easy. But when it's hard, that's when it counts. And so I would ask women to do that. Thank you.
Thank you. Good. Please respond, because I was going to add a sneaky last question in, but if you want to respond to anything that each of you said.
To say to you, when I started organizing in New York, women, I was told we cannot criticize our Asian American brothers because, they are being dominated, etc. And I said, I will be sister to him who is a brother to me.
Maybe Hannana wants to comment on that theme.
Sorry, I've got hearing problems.
Okay.
She was talking that way. So I just saw some parallels. Obviously, you're talking about Indigenous women, and we're talking about the work that we do is about minority women in this country. So have some of the same parallel issues. And I think that, they don't acknowledge patriarchy within those communities, and they homogenize those communities and don't look at the power divisions within it and don't challenge patriarchy. So that there is that kind of, the parallels are there. The discrimination that they experience, the failure of the states are the same. That there's a lot for us to learn from each other in terms of how to take that on and how to kind of build solidarity internationally.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So we've got about 8 minutes left.
So I can't
Sorry,
hear
we've got about
Anything you
just
want
under
to
8
add?
minutes left. Is there anything
Anything
any
that
of you
I
want
haven't
to
add?
add that you
Go on, Sharon.
that you
The only
didn't
thing
get
I
a chance to
haven't
say?
Yeah, the only thing.
The only thing I haven't said is on the
Abbiamo
website, domesticabuseralatedsuicide.org, and you can see what we're doing and what our demands are. So there you go. I've got to get that bit in.
Anything?
Thank you, Karen. All right.
Yeah, so thank you, all of you, for being on this panel. You've been brilliant, and I'm sure I can ask women here to, in a minute, say thank you to all of you. But while we've got everybody quiet, straight after this meeting, we are doing a vigil to commemorate women taken by men's violence. You might have seen in the main reception area downstairs an area near the back where there were red pebbles, and we were asking you to either commemorate a woman that you knew whose life had been taken, and if not, to we had the names of I think 184 women who've been killed in the UK since the last FiLiA, which was in Glasgow 2 years ago. And sorry, I've said 184 women, and then I'm sure I caught Jane Monckton Smith's face down there. And what it reminded me of what I want to say is we're only counting the women who that the state has recognised as being killed by men, and we know that the figure is much greater than that, whether it's women who've taken their lives as a response to male violence, or hidden homicides that are killings, homicides, murders that are disguised as accidents or drug overdoses or something, so that we know that women whose bodies are never found and they're never reported as missing. We know that actually there have been more women in the UK than 184 killed since last FiLiA, but we had the names of the women that we knew about, so that women who didn't know anybody personally could maybe take one of those names and write them on a pebble. So we're asking everybody to meet downstairs, or as many of you as possible, if you can, to take one of the pebbles with a name on you, and we're going to walk across the road and onto the beach and gather on the beach, and then we have a few women who want to speak as part of the vigil for Femicide. So I hope as many of you can join us and do that. But before you do, please say thank you to these brilliant women. Thank you. Okay, thanks.